We're back with more of your favorite. We're your favorite, right? Ergonomic,
Yeah.
doing the thing and the stuff. So today, the thing that I want to talk about, I've been excited about this for a few years, and I got excited about it when I first heard about it, and it came out of James' big brain, and he's been talking about it for 10 years, which is how long it took him to get a PhD, which he really got. So congratulations.
Woo!
The thing that I really fell in love with is it gave me an explanation for what I started calling the core conflict of DevOps, and this lens to explain how there's this inherent tension between dev and ops, but it gets generalized and abstracted and kind of more philosophical way that I think is both interesting to think about and potentially more actionable as we evolve. And then now we started getting Sasha excited about it. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk through where she's at with the ideas, because I think there's a few bumps in the road getting the explanation, but now she's starting to be like part of the core evangelists for the three economies. So we're trying to spread the religion and the understanding of this wonderful philosophy that Jay gave us.
So I think for me, the biggest thing is like what's new, right? So like we already talked about the wall of confusion, right? How do you take that? Like, what's the insight about the three economies compared to like, okay, you know, people don't get along or have different incentives, and that's why it sucks.
Yeah. So I think like I get maybe I'll explain.
Three economies gives you a why. Like the wall of confusion is a solid what, and then three economies gives you more why.
Yeah. So maybe I'll explain really quickly like what I was originally trying to solve with it, just to give you guys a theory, like an idea of where my head was when I first started talking about it. So I was working in large organizations, big multinational companies that had what were called product lines or product families. And so the problem here is that when you take a flow-based method where you're trying to do like value stream mapping and things like that, most people kind of look at value stream mapping and they go, okay, so there's some process that developers do. They talk to some designers design some stuff, then the developers get it, and the developers develop the stuff, and then they give it to QA, and the QA test it, and then they give it to operations, and the operators operate it, and then there's a whole kind of thing like that. And so that, in the DevOps frame, seems to be like a story where value streams flow from development to ops. And the problem I had with that at the time was in traditional actual kind of flow lines inside of like Toyota and other places, they had an idea that's called a Y line. So the idea is roughly this. If you look at, for instance, like Honda's had this for a long time, you could buy a sedan, or you could buy a station wagon, or you could buy a van, and they were all built on the same chassis. So the family line was defined by the product family line was defined by the chassis, and the products were defined by basically what type of car you stuck on top of the chassis. So the Y line part of it is that there would be a straight line that would assemble the chassis, and then there would be a Y where they would break the line off, and up here you'd build trucks, and in the middle you'd build sedans, and down here you'd build something else, right? So
and you even see this across brands now, where Lexus and Toyota have the same frames.
Right. Yep. And so there's not so what the three economies is partially trying to do is point out that like actual value streams in really large organizations the organizations can't afford to have a single stream for every single product. At some point they have to like Y together, and that Ying together where the products meet is now what we tend to call a platform, or what people try to call a platform. Now, it's like the common set of stuff that is common across a set of products, and those products might be in the same family line, product family line. And so the idea was to say, okay, what we need to think about is in traditional ways of managing flow, we would have this kind of core conflict that we see in DevOps. The developers would want to like develop more and more and more and more stuff, and the operators would want to minimize change. And so they would create these policy walls that would like build up policy in order to prevent change from occurring, and try to guarantee that there wouldn't be any failure and all that kind of stuff. And so we got some initial really good, I think, insights about that around things like, hey, wait a second, like you can't actually in a non-deterministic system like we see inside of most software engineering processes, the closest we're going to get is continuous partial failure. We're never going to get perfect, right? So what we need is operations to be able to like deal with what's going wrong as opposed to assume we can get it right. So that was one of the ways to kind of get Dev and Ops to start working together. But at a large enough scale, all of a sudden you have these secondary questions, which is
so for me, one of the generalized core insights is that the tension between innovation and efficiency or cost or reliability is inherent. It's an inherent conflict.
That's right. And you can't get rid of it because, in fact, you want both. So the other way to say this is inside of most organizations, at the top of the organization, you get really bad pendulum swings. And what will happen is either everybody will swing left and say, we need more autonomous, agile teams doing whatever they want to capture a market.
We need developer productivity, rah, 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 give them all anything they want, make more software. And eventually that swings the other way when everybody's like, geez, it costs an infinite amount of money to operate all this stuff. We have like license sprawl, we have an infinite number of libraries. We've got 20 different versions of Oracle and 60 million versions of Java running. It becomes impossible and super expensive to run. So then everything swings back to that side of the house. We need to centralize this stuff. We need to force the developers to adopt specific libraries, specific tools. We need to do, a real like redo of the estate and really like clamp down on licensing. We got to pay down the technical debt.
Got to pay down the technical debt. And so
neither of these is optimal, right? Neither of these is optimal. That's the insight too.
And so like one of the terms I like to use when I talk about flow is you want low turbulence, and pendulum swings are high turbulent environments, right? You go from one way of operating and you swing radically the other side and go to another way of operating. People like have to reorganize their entire work schedule, thought, life, everything about what they're trying to achieve every 12 months. So the idea of having a third economy. So if you've got centralized scope and you've got decentralized differentiation, the middle one, the platform one, is one that we call scope. And the idea is to actively try to manage limiting the amount of change that goes into operations and accelerating differentiation for going into the development teams, which means that there's a set of common resources that basically act as a clutch between these two other games that people are playing, and allow the system to operate without as much turbulence.
For the people that are playing the game at home, I think it would be valuable, and maybe Sasha has a few comments or questions here, to characterize the two economies, and then characterize the scope economy, the third economy.
Yeah, so I was actually just gonna say, like, can we go back to a little bit of a like definition? But also, the thing I was pondering when you were saying this is the clutch is such a good analogy, except who's driving stick shift anymore? So we need.
There's clutches in automatics too.
Yes, but like most people don't think about it. Like there's no action that happens, so like it's a black box that you're not aware of.
Yeah. So the three economies at a highest level is just a very basic idea where you have autonomous teams that are attempting to differentiate themselves. So the way they add value to the company is they allow the company to differentiate itself within a marketplace. So we could go down and talk about Clayton Christensen and a bunch of other ideas about how differentiation works. But the idea is the company gets value because there's some way of differentiating my product from my customer's product, and therefore I can get into different market niches and address different customers. That's the basic idea of differentiation. So value is created by differentiating the product. On the other side of the house, we get a kind of traditional manufacturing theory, which is an economy of scope. And in economy of scale. In economy of scale, the really simple idea is the more frequently we do the same operation over and over and over again, the more efficient we can become at providing the same thing over and over again. So you want to find opportunities to do the same thing many, many times with very, very kind of tight controls on it, right? And so in IT, that tends to look like centralized IT, right? So we can give you servers, we can give you network, we can give you all these types of services that tend to be very common and repetitively used, right? We can fix your firewalls. In really large organizations, it used to be that a lot of that function would be held by outside service providers, right? So in large organizations, you do that by what's called service management. And nowadays, what it tends to happen is that all that stuff is outsourced to your cloud provider, right? So a lot of that stuff that's happening is just happening somewhere else outside your organization. So the problem is that the governance model for governing the type of work that's happening in the organization, if you assume that central IT should dominate, is highly controlling and therefore prevents differentiation. And on the other hand, if you assume that the dominant governance structure should be autonomous teams differentiating things, it prevents the types of efficiencies that you would expect to get at scale. So that's the core conflict. That's the way that the conflict works.
In fact, you're making me think of this being apparent in another thing that, like, another pendulum that is happening in our industry, right? Because in a way, the differentiation teams got around their central IT by going to the cloud. So the cloud actually sped up innovation, and partially not just because there were certain things like available and, you know, better services and whatever, but also because they avoided the tight controls of the central IT, right? But then now we're seeing the chickens come home to roost because someone has to pay for all of it, right? And then, like, you start getting the cloud bills and analyzing the cloud bills, and you're like, oh my God, how much money am I paying for all this?
But I mean, even in the cloud providers, you can see the effective differentiation, the pressure of differentiation on a centralized organization that views the cloud as a product. And what I mean by that is when if you like rewind and you go back to early AWS, they had like 10 different servers kinds you could have. That was it. You pick one of those kinds, that's the ones you could have. Now there's
started with even less than 10.
Yeah. Now there's hundreds of different kinds, right? And that's because people pressured them to create more and more differentiation back there. Now, obviously what they did was they were able to kind of figure out how to efficiently create more and more different types of server types. But originally that was very, very small surface area of differentiation inside of their central IT organization. And so when we go to like many organizations that still run their own internal kind of, they're in a data center, you just find absolute sprawl in their server differentiation. They've got many, many different kinds of servers, different CPUs, different configurations, different operating systems, different, hand done pet cattle, things, all that type of stuff.
So I think we should characterize the scope economy, but first, I think it's valuable for people to understand why you call this an economy, and maybe because I think sometimes that's a little confusing for people.
I have another prompt, which was like maybe after what Andrew said, but like there is a particular picture you like to use, and so I think like if you can share a screen and like talk about the funnel and what the funnel represents, it could also be helpful.
Yep. So really quickly, so I like the word economy. The simpler word to use would just be game. There's different games inside of organizations. There's different incentives involved in those games, and if you want to win the game to get the incentive, right? And so in different parts of the organization, people are playing different games, and they're incentivized differently on how they should be winning that game. Now, the reason I like economy is just it adds one more thing to the idea of a game that more explicitly, which is there's some limited resource that needs to be effectively shared appropriately, right? So that economies are basically about how do I take some constrained resource and distribute it equitably or appropriately, right?
Allocate.
So, yeah, allocate. So So in the sense of a scope economy, the way that a scale economy, the way that we do that is we centralize control and we try to make sure that as many people can have as much access to the very tightly defined little objects that we can make. Everybody gets the same apple, but there's lots of apples. On the other side of the equation, in a differentiation economy, everybody would like to have different kinds of apples or different types of products that were made out of apples. They want apple pies, they want hand pies, they want candied apples, they want caramel apples. All those things are how we create value on that side. So the way that people are incentivized on that side of the house is to take the basic resource, an apple, and figure out how many different ways can we serve apples to people so that we can try to find all the people like apple pies, all the people like caramel pies, all those types of things.
So I need to add another question, right? Which is, so related concept is the commons, right? And it also took me a minute to understand it. Like, what's the difference? Like, what does 3 economies add compared to the concept of commons? Also, like, the concept of commons probably needs to be explained a little bit because, like, not everyone's familiar with it as well.
Sure. All right. So really quickly, originally the commons were any so we'll put it in England first. The commons in England were, for instance, forests that were held in common by the people of England, and it meant that, like, if you wanted to go hunting, you could go hunting, and you could kill deer and harvest mushrooms, whatever you wanted to do out in the forest. And at some point, they decided, hey, wait a second, what happens if, like, the deer get over harvested? Like, there's not enough deer to kind of self-sustain. And so they decided that they needed to figure this out. And what they did was what was called the enclosure movement. And the basic idea of the enclosure movement is the best way to manage land is to assign a person to own the land. So instead of owning it in common, we would assign it to specific people. And those specific people then would be able to decide the rules about who could come on the land, how many deer they could take, all that kind of stuff. But it became responsible. Individuals became responsible for it. And so you can think of it this way. Radically autonomous would be the original commons, right? And radically centralized ownership is kind of the more, personal ownership is the enclosure movement, and then centralized governance is like control of public parks, right? So you get 3 different ideas of different ways of managing land, right?
Which is actually, this is an interesting one because in the majority of places today, it's either or. Like, there's not really a concept of common land, which is why this analogy, like, kind of doesn't even work nowadays. Like, I mean, it does, but it doesn't, because people think, oh, a Central Park is common land. It's not. It's owned by the government.
That's right. Yeah.
But there's maybe something near and dear to our heart, right? Because open source projects at their best are true commons governed by a community. So
and that's the idea, right? Is that there's an idea that there's certain types of resources that are appropriately managed by a centralized group. So, for instance, like sewer systems in towns are well managed by a centralized authority. Like, we don't want a bunch of people randomly dumping sewage in the streets, right? Seems like having someone manage how to figure that out. That's a centralized problem, right? Decentralized problems are like, hey, what should I plant in my backyard? Like, nobody should have anything to do with, like, what I'm planting in my backyard. I can plant whatever I want in theory, right? On the other hand, when you look at something like a community garden, then you get a slightly different set of problems, right? Like, hey, this is a limited amount of space and there's a certain amount of people and we all want to be able to grow vegetables together. So we need to figure out what size plots, how many people can be in here? How do we, like, pay for it? Like, who is doing a lot of the work? Does we all weed everybody's lot? Do we only weed our own part of the lot? All that kind of stuff. So commons,
who can harvest what?
Who can harvest what? And commons in particular are a combination of a form of governance and the management of that resource so that it is sustainable. So it's those 2 things in conjunction with each other. Because the tragedy of the commons is this idea that, so the traditional version of this is, let's say there's a field in the middle of town, and people can put their cows on the field, right, to eat the grass. So everybody can put cows on it, blah, blah, blah. If someone were into game theory, they could really quickly figure out the way to win this game is this. Put as many of your cows on the field as possible. Why? Because for as long as your cows are more than everybody else's cows, you're winning. And if all the grass gets destroyed and everybody's cows die, you still had more cows for longer. So technically you won. So the tragedy of the commons has to do with the way that commons tend to collapse if you have people who are avaricious or greedy using them. And the guy who came up with that, would get along with the whole, MAGA front, because he really believed that the problem with the United States was we were allowing too many foreigners to come in and take advantage of the commons. But anyway,
I think we should at least make a shout out to Demeji.
Yes, exactly.
Onafua, and some of the ideas that I've heard him and you discuss before about commoning and commons. But the tragedy of the commons is basically refuted in other ways. So I'm very familiar with the mathematical framing of the tragedy of the commons, and the core idea is that it will collapse, but you have to also you have to recognize people are rational, and hopefully, I have hope, everything's not so short term, right? Because the problem of the commons as a framing that collapses is because people are willing to exploit it until it collapses.
That's right. Yep.
But
I mean, we can talk about climate change or whatever, but
No, absolutely. And I think we're failing some of those tests, but in other ways, maybe the crisis isn't great enough because we don't see, I mean, part of it, if you build these mathematical models and you start to see, like you can do the model of the grass in the field, or you can do the model of the fish in the sea. And what happens, and this is probably related to the climate change comment, is that the way that these populations replenish makes it so there's this gradual decline, and everyone gets a little less and a little less and a little less, and everyone's like still making money, getting their fish, getting their grass, whatever, and then it's just like it's just gone. Right. And
the very slowly boiling frog, which I believe also has been refuted. Like you actually can't slowly boil a frog. Like that fable is incorrect.
But it's actually not slow, because it looks like a gradual thing, and then because it's a parabola basically.
That's right.
Gradually,
it just goes like straight down, and then once you get past a certain threshold, there's no base to reproduce. There's no way for it to replenish. So that's why, and you see this in history, these collapsing fisheries around the world from overfishing, that everyone got less, and then like the fish are just gone. Like they're gone.
Yep.
Forever gone. Yep. So
I'm not going to make more comments about global dynamics.
But I mean, so the dynamic that Andrew's talking about is also applicable in any organization with WIP, work in progress. So the same thing happens. As you increase work in progress, it's just like boiling a frog until it hits a tipping point, at which point the whole organization gets jammed because there's so much work in progress that nothing can get done anymore.
The wait time goes to infinity, and everyone wonders why. But to get out of this rabbit hole, to me, the core insight in the kind of three economies and the emergence of the scope economy as this clutch or platform in the middle to connect the two, is that the scope economy emerges from the ongoing negotiation between the selfish interests and the collective interests.
That's right.
If there's only selfish interests, you're going to have the collapse.
That's right.
And so recognizing that we have a common goal, that there's some organizational mission, company, success that we all want to be part of, that's what gives you the opportunity to have a successful platform.
That's right. And you have to differentiate that too from centralized organization, right? Like the central IT style, right? So the way that people used to think about, like, how do we manage multiple autonomous teams? They have common things. How do we do that? Oh, we'll just create a centralized governing structure, which just means that there's like a committee owns it now instead of having the individual team owns it. And that causes its own set of problems, right? So I think that one of the biggest challenges in organizations is learning how to share resources. That's the biggest challenge, right?
The kindergarten lessons.
Right, 100%. And so the problem is that all of the like techniques that we have for like doing agile and all these kind of other ideas for how to like manage work and all that kind of stuff and portfolio management, all that stuff is all about managing autonomous projects. And it isn't about understanding how to manage shared things. And the result of that, I think, is pretty clear. In lots of different ways. One of the most clear ways is the dominance of Agile has like destroyed the practice of architecture in many organizations. They just don't know how to do architecture well anymore because they don't think about like how to share things. They might architect applications, individual applications, but they don't architect the product family idea. They don't have that set of structures inside the organization that do that well. And organizations that have things like enterprise architecture, those people tend to be involved with managing procurement processes as opposed to actually creating shared resources that are effectively reutilized, et cetera.
In many ways, and this is like almost it deserves its own podcast hour discussion. The enterprise architects are effectively managing the rectangles of the vendors on a PowerPoint slide.
That's right. If I buy your product, how do I put it into my pre-existing stack of boxes, please? And tell me the reference architecture so I don't have to work too much. As opposed to working with teams and working with product owners. So like one of the things that I try to convince people all the time is you probably have a product roadmap somewhere in your organization, whether it's good or not is beside the point. You probably have a technical roadmap that in theory is being driven by architects, enterprise architect type people. How often do the people managing your technical roadmap and your product roadmap actually sit down and make sure that they're supporting each other? Like, does this technical roadmap actually support the product roadmaps that we have? Does the product roadmaps inform the technical roadmap, or are they just like ships passing in the night? And in most organizations that I've looked at, the answer is they don't talk to each other. And that's a problem, I think.
Well, they have these different games they're trying to win. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Right. I think, and you mentioned it briefly, right? But like one of the different points between the commons and the three economies is that with the commons, usually everyone's playing the same game, whereas with the three economies, we have explicitly different games played in the different parts of the organization, right? And so then the idea is just we are trying to get, what was it? Making rationality global, right? Like we're going to try to make this a thing, right? Reconcile different incentives from different parts of the organization. And the reason like the DevOps transformations or whatever fail all the time is because it is hard to do. And it like you have to continuously put effort into it.
Yeah. So the one weird insight about commons that I talk about in the three economies, and it has to do with the cows and consumability. So in traditional theories about commons, the resource has to be consumable. And what that means is like the grass, if you keep eating the grass, it has to actually go away. If you keep eating the fish, they actually have to go away. So like the primary problem that most people think about commons with is like this perishable resource, consumable resource, right? And so one of the weird things in IT that's not necessarily true with physical goods is that there are common resources that are not consumed and used in IT. It's a strange thing that doesn't exist in other economies as clearly. In other places, they might call it intangible products is another term that people tend to use inside of economics theory. But in this particular case, what we're talking about is things like data. If people consume the same data over and over again, does it like lose value? Does it get used up?
Or running the same code.
Running the same code, using PRRs to make sure people are using the same patterns over and over again, so that like when you think about like things like resilience in the sense that like things in general have generally the same shape, like they're using roughly the same patterns, so that if something goes wrong, the team trying to figure out what's going wrong has a general idea of the boundaries or the constraints that the system normally operates under. So if you think about it, a completely unconstrained system, part of the reason why it's difficult to maintain is if someone's been hand maintaining a server under their desk and something goes wrong and they're not around, people literally have no idea where to start debugging the problem because they have no idea what's on the server, how it's built, any of that kind of stuff. So, the whole idea at some level of things like infrastructure as code and some of the stuff that Andrew worked on originally, Chef, Puppet type stuff is like we should at least know the state at some point, and it can drift off of that state a little bit, but we should try to know what the state is we're starting from, right? And so that set of resources and ways of thinking have to do with like reproducing shared things, so that there's a shared way that infrastructure is done. There's a shared way that risk and compliance are processed, so that those things don't get consumed. They gain in value as people use them more.
The more people share them and adopt them, the more valuable they become. I kind of want to go back to the comment Sasha just made about making rationality global.
Yeah.
So that so there's a conversation that happened recently, and we'll protect all the guilty parties, but talking about some organizational dynamics and these ideas and the games people play. Someone made the comment that people playing this other game on the other side of this wall, they're stupid.
Yeah.
And what I try to convince them of is they're actually not stupid. They're actually, because of the way that they're incentivized and the way that their game, their economy is set up, they're playing with a nearly optimal strategy. In fact, they're playing very, very intelligent given the constraints of the system. And then, you can get into game theory and a bunch of these other things about game theory is based on the idea that you have these rational agents. They're trying to maximize some utility function. And so if you start with that as an assumption and think about what's happening, everyone in the system is locally rational at the limits of the game that they've been given to play and the information they have about the outcome that they're driving. And what I think the opportunity is, and where all these transformations fail, is to connect the information across all these different workflows, across all these different capabilities in your organization, so that people can make the globally rational decision that will maximize the outcome for the company. Hopefully you have leadership that will reward you for doing that, right? Because that's part of the problem too. If you have executives that have set up a game for themselves where their bonuses are diametrically opposed to each other, the chance that practitioners are going to be able to do that work in alignment is zero, maybe negative. So I think that the big picture, organizational learning, whatever you want to call it, is about making people recognize the collective outcome and getting them to negotiate in favor of the collective outcome. And that requires, at least on some level, giving them a game that they can win that's connected to that bigger outcome.
Yep. And I think like one of the things that we also discussed that I think is, part of my dissertation and part of the way that I kind of think about things is, so it seems obvious initially to think of local as being like development teams and operations teams. These are localities inside the organization. There's a set of rationality that has to do with development. There's a set of rationality that has to do with operations, blah, blah, blah. So that's one form of local. Like you can think of it like the org structure tends to have localities in it, right? But the other locality, the other thing that defines rationality is the temporal locality. So are we talking about what makes sense in the next 2 weeks, the next 6 months, the next year, the next 5 years? Those are different rational outcomes would be applied or thought about if you took a 5-year lens than you took a 2-week lens, right? And so the question is like, does the nature of all the work that you do in your organization, does it all live in one temporal locality, or does it, or do different types of work, are they more appropriate for different temporalities? So for instance, if you're doing like highly experimental work in order to figure out what new features your customers want, you probably don't need to build it to exist for 5 years yet. You don't need to make that type of investment yet, right? You can probably manage that in a temporal locality of like 2 weeks to 3 months, right? And you build it to live that long. And then once you figure out, oh, this is a thing that people like, you might say, okay, so we need to relocate this into a different temporality. Now this is going to be with us for 2 years or 5 years. So we have to build it and operate it to a different level of quality because it needs to be more sustainable for a longer period of time. So managing like the way that work flows through different.
Ain't nobody got time for that. Just put it in production.
Exactly. And so I think that's, when we talk about ergometrics and stuff like that, one of the things that we want to help people think about is how does work not just flow through the system, but how do different temporalities come to play with the relationships between different parts of the system, right? So are there different cadences that people should be meeting on? Are there different things that they should be talking about on different cadences? Are different conversations, different metrics, different measurements, different dashboards?
And speaking of conversations, we should have a separate conversation about metrics, I think, because like you can talk about metrics for 3 days, and implement metrics, strive for perfection forever. But I think the biggest thing that happens is that people measure things without looking at them. So like one thing is don't measure things at all, but then measure things without looking at them. And then the third thing is measure things and look at them and then overdrive one particular number to the exclusion of everything else. So like it's easy to get metrics wrong, and yet metrics are sort of the one thing that can help you get it right. I think that not looking at them is so endemic though. Like it's incredible to what extent people like gather all this data, have all these products that we're paying like millions of dollars to just be able to gather and store all this data, and then like not actually look at it.
Yep. I mean, so I think there's 2 comments. I'll add one. First, I'll add one to your list of problems. The other one is setting a target without knowing what the current performance is. So in other words, people do this all the time. They automatically break their implementation of a metric because they set an overly aggressive target that can't be achieved by the current performance remotely. And therefore people intentionally like make it hard to see that they're not performing, right? So instead of saying, hey, could you just go off and measure this metric for like 3 months or 2 months or 2 weeks, whatever, and come back and just tell me what's our current range of performance around this thing. Okay, now let's set a target. Now that we know the current range, we could set it like 10% improvement per 6 months or whatever. But instead of saying like we need to double our performance that we are unaware of right now.
Or like how many people strive for like 5 nines without knowing what their current nines is, and like how to even measure the nines.
And nines itself is subjective.
Yep, exactly. Which temporal window are you measuring your nines in? All that kind of other stuff. Like I think it's interesting. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing about setting up measurement systems, the metric systems, is people tend to use them as lists as opposed to systems. And one of the things that I try to argue all the time is that it's really important to understand that when you're measuring something in these cadenced reviews, it's important to understand them as a system of measurements as opposed to a list of measurements. So instead of having the assumption that every measurement is independent of all the others, it's really important to start thinking about, if this measurement goes up, it's likely that this other measurement would go down. So are we watching to make sure that they're balanced, or are we just looking at each one and not noticing when the other one goes up or down?
So I know this is a like sort of sidetrack, but I still want the to see the variation funnel. Like
totally.
Can we talk about that?
Yeah, let me see if I can get you guys. I have a picture of it somewhere, I'm sure. Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll just show you my website. That's what I'll do.
Yeah, because you have a website and it's a lot.
What are you insinuating, Sasha? What happened recently? Is it that my website went down?
It's that you can't buy a platform.
You can. You just can't turn your back on it.
Exactly. If you don't pay the ransom, they take your stuff. AKA don't use Bluehost, but I didn't say that out loud. Okay. Let's see. I present. Can I present a share screen?
Drum roll.
I don't know what's going to happen when I share my screen. Oh, it does give me a selection of which I want to share. I was like, am I going to share everything? What's about to be shared? Can you see that, Sasha? Here we go.
Good. Yeah.
That'd be
Okay. So there's this other really important idea that has to do with product lines and flow, and I call it an idea of investing in variation, right? Or your budgeting or your investment of variation across the system. So one of the ways to think about it, the really simple way to think about it is this. Any system under a certain amount of variation will fall apart, right? If there's just too many different ways of doing things, it becomes impossible to do anything. And so it kind of comes apart at the seams, right? So that means that every system, there's a certain amount of variation that it can tolerate in the way that it operates, right? So that means that it's a budget or an economic problem. And so then there's a secondary question, which is like, is there parts of the organization where variation are more valuable? If you were going to spend your variation budget, there's part of the organizations where it's more valuable to spend the variation than in other parts. And so the three economies points out that the most valuable place to spend your variation is in differentiation. And the least valuable place to spend your variation is in scale. So I like to think of it like a toothpaste tube. What you're trying to do is squeeze the variation out of ops into the platform and then squeeze it even more out of the platform so that all the variation, as much as possible, ends up in the differentiation. So you want as much variation in differentiation, a minimal amount of variation in scope so that the differentiation teams are able to operate, and as little variation in scale as possible. That's the kind of way that the funnel works. And so there's a secondary version of that, which has to do with the difference between these two words, variation and variability. So one of the ways to think about this is this. Variation is the intentional creation of difference. So having multiple different models of cars come off of one product line is variation. It's good. Variability is the unintended wiggle in a system that causes problems. So like having bolts of all different sizes is variability, and that's not necessarily good. So if we look at like statistical process control and things like that, it's an attempt to control variability. But the thing that people miss about that the most, in my mind, is the whole idea Shewhart had, the whole idea Deming had, was that by reducing variability, you can increase variation in the same system. So basically, it's another description of this funnel, right? What you're doing in the scale is you're squishing out the variability, the unintended wiggles in the system, like the fact that you have different operating systems for no real good reason, and you're trying to squish all that to the front so that you can have as much variation, as many different versions of the product as possible at the closest point to where the customers are. So another way to think about this is that your differentiation teams are the teams that are closest to your market, and your market in theory should be like the most variable part of the system. The most variation should be in the market itself, right? There's lots of different customers, different countries, different laws, different states, lots and lots and lots of things that you have to kind of adjust to. And so what you want is to take all of the variation you can and apply it to that marketplace in order to make it serve the individuated little parts of the market better. And the idea of that, the kind of broader idea of that outside of Toyota, is what's called Ashby's law, and it has to do with what's called requisite variation. And the thing that I try to convince people of is that the balancing part of requisite variation is requisite coherence. It's how do you get stuff to stick together without coming apart. Right.
So I want to make a quick comment about this, and this is one of my favorite topics when we use this funnel, is that when you have these three economies as a idea, then you can examine the innovation that's happening in differentiation and try to identify things that would be useful to be brought back into the platform and be shared across all the rest of the efforts. And conversely, on the other side of it, you can recognize that there might be resources that are too tightly controlled with your governance model on the scale side of it, and recognize that those might be more valuable if they were brought into this self-service platform in the middle.
That's right. And that's what we call recommoning, right? Is that there's certain things that are being governed poorly because they're using the wrong governance model. And if you shift it to the right governance model, you get better economic outcomes from that particular resource. And I think that there's some things that are probably, the traditional way of kind of like people have heard of it is like shadow ops, right? Shadow ops is an example of, in theory, if you let shadow ops go out of control in your organization, you have too much shadow ops, you have a poor economic performance because the system is trying to manage things that it shouldn't be managing in the wrong economic frame, right?
But it's also because you have a poor economic model that you set up the incentives such that is inevitable.
That's right. Because you have no way of sharing those resources effectively. You have some sort of central IT department that makes it difficult for the differentiation teams to do their work, right? And so the differentiation teams are willing to take on the extra economic burden of producing their own whatever, server, framework, whatever. They're willing to do that in order to get the tempo that they need to get.
Yeah, it's about the time scale that they need this work on.
Well, and back to your comment, like no one is silly. Most people act in accordance to their incentives, and so if the organization set up incentive to one team to be very tight, to be exerting very tight control, and to the other team to be innovating as fast as possible, you will get these results too.
That's right. Yep.
Well, the unfortunate reality in a lot of cases is that the way that this stuff gets accounted for, one side gets to take credit for all the P and the other side has to eat all the L.
That's correct. In a lot of organizations, especially kind of since the 90s, innovation has been highly valued because the way that markets have rewarded companies is by kind of the differentiation game. Please prove that you can grow your market as quickly as possible. Start with a niche market, prove you can hit that niche market, and then grow the marketing, make more and more customers, right? And so innovation has been largely driven by that attempt to figure out how to make a product serve as many different types of customers as possible, as quickly as possible. And that's all been built on the fact that eventually you'll have to pay down the debt of doing that. And you can see some organizations have been relatively successful at doing that. Spotify did that type of work for a long time. They took on huge amounts of debt in order to make as many customers as possible. But you can look at other places like what was the shared office space that collapsed by doing the same thing.
WeWork.
WeWork.
I mean, so this model has been exercised by so many people in the environment of VC free money, right, and all that stuff. But there's the relevant idea that just came up when I was talking to Casey Rosenthal, and it's also in the Chaos Engineering book. But basically, when you improve your reliability, it's like a currency that gets spent in other parts of the organizations, right? So when you make an improvement in economy of scale, or even in the platform and stuff like that it gets consumed potentially by the development or by the differentiation economy, and then the innovation again gets all the credit. So you actually improved other parts, right? You actually improved your reliability, but you the crown goes to again the developers potentially. And
so that idea is called the law of induced demand, and there's another really great paper that is called the fundamental law of highway congestion. And so this is really simple idea, right? If you ever see pictures of LA with all the traffic jams, you can see that the roads are constantly getting wider. They're adding more and more lanes, but that doesn't actually help the problem, because the more lanes there are, the more people think that they should have a car. So the more cars show up in the first place. And it is a negative effect of scope economies, right? So one of the things that can happen in a scope economy is that a shared resource can be seen as creating network effects. In other words, there's value created by the fact that more and more people use it. So more and more people use it until it reaches a tipping point, and then it just becomes overly consumed, right? And you can see this inside IT organizations. I used to talk to people about this a bit. When we first did, I have this objection to self-service systems, and it is based on this. If you make it very, very simple for people to consume resources inside the organization without having any economic controls or any other ways of thinking about those systems, and then you find out like 6 months later, your Amazon bill is through the ceiling. Well, why are you surprised? You created induced demand. You lowered the barrier of creating more consumption, right? And so I think there's all sorts of things to consider about that.
That was your quote, like, right? Sorry, your variability to cope makes the situation worse, right? Like, or in other words, that this is fine of the graphic of like PagerDuty or whatever, anyone in IT being on call. If I can deal with the incident, that like no one else sees the cost of the incident, so therefore it must be fine.
Yep.
But I feel like this is two great examples, almost the opposite examples of failures to have global rationality.
That's right.
And in the first example, the fact that the differentiation economy gets all the credit and the scale economy gets none of the credit is a failure of the leadership to create the right incentives and connect everything to the greater mission, to the bigger outcome, the collective interest. And then conversely, it's the same thing, that if there's not some model that connects, so the scope economy gets more valuable as people reuse those patterns, but there is still some resource that's consumed in the scale economy. There's networks and storage and computers or whatever that are going to be used, and there has to be some global rationality about understanding that, some stewardship of those resources, or you're just going to run into those problems. So it's really, to me, both of those examples are failure to create global rationality in the organization.
Yeah, and so like when I was doing a lot of this work originally, I was working with a global CTO of a like Fortune 20 company, and I spent a lot of time saying to him and to his VPs, no, you can't choose one. You have to do all three. You can't choose one of these. Your job is to manage the interaction between them. You can't choose to let the differentiation people win. You can't choose to let the scale people win. You have to actually manage all three of these different economic ideas inside your organization. And to the extent that in a lot of organizations, what you see the pendulum is, again, they're trying to either manage differentiation or scale. And so the only way to stabilize that, in my mind, is to, again, inject these scope economies with network effects between those two and manage the relationships between, again, as Andrew was saying, just because you have a scope economy doesn't mean that the scope economy isn't consuming scale resources. So
what the scope economy should let you do is create something that optimally uses the scale economy resources.
That's right.
But it doesn't mean that those resources magically became infinite.
That's correct. That's exactly right. So there's still something to be managed there. And you can make the management of those things easier by having the scope economy require less variation of the scale resources. But that doesn't minimize the consumption of the scaled resources. In fact, you could argue that one of the ways to manage the scale economy is to add extra pads to the scale objects. In other words, for instance, like if you want to have less types of servers, you should oversize the servers a little bit. That gives it more headroom so that you can use this type of server and not try to create maximum efficiency, which creates more variation in the back end, right? If you have very tight tolerances for the different types of servers you use, like I have one that has 16 gigs of RAM and one that has 32 gigs of RAM, one that has 64 gigs of RAM. The question ends up being like, is there an economic benefit to having that variation, or should you just get everybody 64 gigs of RAM and be done with it?
There's a whole nother rabbit hole that could take another hour, but when you get to maximal efficiency, you also tended to maximize the brittleness and reduce the resilience of your system.
100%. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Both the socio and the technical side of it.
That's right. Yep. So the conversation that we were having with Sasha earlier this week, where we were talking about like the fact that efficacy and efficiency are two sides of the same coin, right? Like if you overdrive efficiency, you probably break efficacy at some point. Whereas if you focus on efficacy, the ability to do the thing well, efficiency tends to follow, right? So I just think that it's a trick that, again, is from the Lean playbook. Focus on value and cost will fall. Focused on cost and value will fall. You just have to keep that in mind as you're moving forward with some of these ideas.
It seems like everyone needs to relearn that lesson over and over, though.
Every 10 years. I read the first time I read Deming's Out of Crisis. I read the whole book and then I stopped and I opened it up and looked at the title page to see when it was written, and it was written a year before I was born, and I threw it across the room and was like, we're gonna have to keep learning these lessons every year, I guess, for the rest of our lives.
This happens to me regularly.
Half of my internal dialogue for the last hour was like Deming and Acuff quotes, like popping into my head. Like,
exactly right. Yeah, it's so frustrating.
This is funny. This happens to me so much with like you read something and you're like, this is amazing. Wait, it's been 50 years. Why are we still talking about this? Oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, it's depressing because like, Deming was on TV. Like he was a celebrity basically, right?
He wasn't on TV till the 80s, right? So he like had to go through his own struggle in the 50s to get to the why can't America
because his insights only worked for the women. Come on, like that's anyway. On this note, also John Willis, who was commenting on a couple of things, wrote a book about Deming, which you all should read.
You should read it.
It's a really nice book about Deming.
It is great.
So we had our this is just how we talk all the time to each other. But we turned on the live stream for the last hour, and we could go on for another couple hours, but we should probably get some other work done today. I feel like this was pretty fun. We covered some interesting ground, and if anyone wants to reach out and continue different threads of this conversation or go into some of the details, then set it up on LinkedIn and we'll do it.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
All right.
Talk soon.
Parting wisdom. Go build something.
Go build something. Absolutely. That's a good idea.
Make rationality global.
Make rationality global.
Time back.